Hello, this video is on editing a Google Sheet from Bubble. This is actually a request I've gotten from 3 people. I did post a video on just displaying our Google Sheet, which may look something like this with a lot of rows of, for example, customer data, and then just displaying it. And of course, the next step is that we go to any such a row and we edit the name from, John the 5th to John the 7th, and we click Save. And the changes are updated over here in Bubble and also over here in our Google Sheet. So to do this, we did use the Sheetie API. Most of the setup is in the other video I'll link below. But Sheetie, basically, if you're new to watching this, is a service which allows you to easily connect any Google Sheet with APIs, such as the Bubble API. So here we have a sheet. So the entire sheet is called test tips, and then the subsheet we're looking at is called emails. I think my head covers this, but it just believe me that this subsheet is called emails. And here we have told Sheetie in the dashboard to enable get requests, to enable post, to enable put requests, and delete requests. Okay, and then any such service usually has a place. In this case, we click Learn for the API documentation, and this is what we read to properly set up the API connector on Bubble. So we go here over to Plugins, and we find ourselves the plugin API connector. We might have to install that underneath Add Plugins if we don't have it yet. And we created one called Sheetie. And you may read here that a tip here, content type has to be application JSON, otherwise it won't work. So therefore we have here a shared header, content type application JSON. You can also add authentication so that not everyone can just kind of edit your Google Sheet, but a password needs to be in here. Okay, and then we have the different requests. So last time we did the get request. So a get request, just to remind you, just gets the data from Sheets and displays it in Bubble. Okay, and so how do we know it's this URL? Because Sheetie here underneath get tells us to just kind of copy this URL, and we see our kind of worksheet name and our subsheet as tips emails. Okay, and the next part is editing a row. So we can see here, again, same setup, subsheet, and now 2 is for the row we want to edit. So in this case, in this example here, we want to edit row 2. And then the amend we want to make in this case is we want to edit row 2. So the new name is Said C and email said@gmail.com. Okay, and so when we go over here, we also add a put request. So we just had to click add another call. And we put in this URL. And here, because we don't just always want to edit row 2, we want to make this a variable. So therefore we add a parameter and call it a row. And here at the start, we just make the value 3, because at the start, before we kind of continuously use it on our Bubble app, we first have to initialize the call so that the two establish a connection and know in what way to communicate between each other, Bubble and Sheetie. So we can put any value here, like 3. Okay, again, we've got the header, content type, application JSON. Okay, and then we have a body. This is what this was. But we want to be able to, if you see here our repeating group, we want to be able to input anything into our input and save that data. So not only John 7, but we also may want to completely rename them to Paul. Okay, or maybe Anna if they switch their gender, as is very common nowadays. Okay, and we then therefore have to again put the sheet or the subsheet name and then the column titles, name, email, number. And here to make it variable again, we add these arrows. And then Bubble asks us just for our kind of call initialization, what value do we want? So we just want to change the name to A, the email to B, and the number to C, just to see it work. And that's it. So we basically went to the documentation, we copied the format to first look at the subsheet and then the columns. And then we do have a comma between each of the columns, but not in the last one. So we did that here too. We have a comma here, we have a comma here, but none here. The right amount of brackets. Okay, and then we can click reinitialize call. And here we click show raw data. Basically, we told it to go to row 3, ID 3, name, email, number, ABC. And also here we can, maybe you've got dates in your Google Sheet, therefore you might have to tell it to actually use the bubble format date. Or you may, I think the first time here it said text, I changed this to number. So you may have to change it so you have the right data showing. Also, a word of warning here, you see ID is 3, which might be a little surprise because if you look at our columns in the Google Sheet, we don't have a column called ID, but this is just actually a column that Sheety uses, and therefore you should not use. So you should not have a column which is called ID here, because it will kind of override this column. So when you would initialize again, you would only get 3 instead of 4 readings. So the number and the ID kind of would conflict with another. So try to not call it column ID. In this case, we call it number, because ID is just, most pieces of data have an ID. So therefore, also bubble rows have a ID. Maybe it's called unique ID, but it's still an ID. Okay, and so then we click save. And then we've established the connection. And we go over to our repeating group. And kind of, you might remember from the last video, we had a repeating group. And normally the way to now use a GET request is that here we select, I think we called it API filter row email. And then we can do get data from an external API. And then we do Sheety API get rows and then email. But the problem with this is that here we're doing something new. We're actually saving changes, and we want this change to immediately update without us having to reload the page. And so therefore, using just a simple GET request here is not enough. We actually have to use a state. So I put a state on the repeating group, and I called it get rows, and you can not only select the data types you have in Bubble, but also the ones kind of we created through the API. So we called it API get row, and we made it a list of things because we want to display a list of all the rows we've got here. We want to display this list here in our repeating group. So we have a list, and on page load, ignore step 1 and 2. In step 3, we actually then set the state to be exactly the Sheety API get rows emails. You might also be a little confused why it says here header time. So the reason is this is also to help with the refreshing. So when we go back to the get request up here, we actually added a header called time with a value of t, or that means we can just add any value later. And this allows us to easily refresh the data by having as the header the current date time, and then we selected formatted as simplified extended ISO. Current date time formatted as simplified extended ISO. Okay, so on page load, we therefore load the repeating group. And then the next part is what happens here in the repeating group. So now that we've told it to expect kind of things from the data type API get rows email, we can now refer to it. So similar as if you had a repeating group of restaurants showing the current sales restaurant's name or opening hours, you can then refer to parent group's APIs get rows emails name, or the email, or the number. Or I've also displayed the field ID, which is not in my Google Sheet, but which kind of Sheety uses to display the row number. Okay, and then we've got a place to edit this. So I've got a hidden group, which is normally hidden and collapsed when hidden. Down here, when we click the edit button, we show this. And here I've got inputs, which have as the placeholder the current email and initial content too. But when we click Save Changes, this is where the magic happens. So we therefore have to just kind of carry out the put request. This is quite cool. So what we did with an API connector is we basically defined how such a call will look in the body. We told it that it will kind of take one sheet, and of that sheet a certain row, and of that row edit the name, email, number exactly as specified. So we can now actually select this underneath the workflows. It will be underneath plugins and Sheetie API put. And then we just have to fill out which row do we want to edit, which number, which name, and which email should we then have as update. So it has the default values we had from the test, but we can update this also to dynamic data, to anything like the current user's birth date, anything. It's very cool. So in our case, the row we want to do is the one of the parent group. So it's just, here we're clicking Save Changes. So of course we want to amend this row, and when we click Save over here, we want to amend this row. Okay, and then the number we want to update it is the input number, and the name is input name, and the email is input email. And then we just hide the group. And now the problem is it would not actually display those changes because you would first have to refresh the page. That's why we use the state. So therefore we update the state. So we tell it again to run the same kind of GET request, and again with the current date time formatted as simplify extended ISO. And that will update it. Okay, that's already it. Another cool thing you can do, by the way, is here we have our list of get rows, and at the end we can actually select sorted by number. So we can sort all the rows depending on the number in this sheet. Maybe we want to make this a 2. Okay, and now when we edit something, so when we, for example, edit this row, we can change this to 0, and this should be the new one at the top. So James, if we click at the start, is now at the top in the first row because it's understood to take all the rows and order them by the number here. And this 5 or 2 or 3, that's just the row number here in Google Sheets. But watch out, in this case it counts the header. So kind of this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's why we see 0 and 5, which is exactly how it fits here. So therefore, you may have to always subtract 1, right? So you may have to always do ID -1 here. Otherwise, the rows won't be the same and update accordingly. Or maybe you can also make it so that one number is never changed. So in the put request, we could have also made sure that we just remove this line, so we never ever change the number, and that always stays consistent like in the Google Sheet. Okay, so just to go back again quickly, we added the API connector, we added a new call with Sheetie with a content type application JSON. We have a GET request, we have a PUT request. We took this URL over from here. We enabled the PUT request over here, where we joined our sheet to the Sheetie API. And then we told it what to edit, so that to edit the name and the email depending on what we input. We initialized the call with some ABC random parameters, and then we were able to use a GET request. We, however, first set it up to set a state on page load, and then we went over and saved changes using the new kind of workflow actions we basically installed using the API connector to edit exactly that row to have the inputs values, and then we re-updated the state. Okay, I hope this video helped you. I will have a list on tiplister.com to show you how to use a delete request to delete rows. And of course, if you delete, let's say, row 4, you also want row 5 to become the new row 4, row 6 to become the new row 5. So to do that using the put request. Hope you enjoyed and this video helped you. Have a nice day. Cheers.